Protesting is a part of our democratic rights, but it appears there are more folks watching than you might think. Surveillance systems are getting more complex, and simply posting a picture could endanger those gathered to decry institutional injustice. And so on this episode of the Oxford Sparks Big Questions podcast, we are asking, how is technology being used to track Black Lives Matter protesters? Hello, I'm Emily Elias, and this is the show where we seek out the brightest minds at the University of Oxford, and we ask them the big questions. And for this one, we've reached a researcher who thinks about all of the data-related things that you don't want to think about.
My name is Anjuli Shere. I'm a doctoral student in cybersecurity at the Centre for Doctoral Training in Cybersecurity at Oxford. And my research focuses on protecting journalists from new emerging cyber threats.
But you also have a very unique skill set that has actually got you on TV.
Yes, so my professional experience covers a wide range of things. I briefly, when I was a teenager, worked at a private investigative agency. I've written for a national news outlet, and my most notable one, I guess, is my summer job as an intelligence analyst on the television show Hunted, which is on Channel 4.
9 ordinary people are about to go on the run from a team of expert hunters.
And that involves, I guess, my primary responsibility is profiling, which sort of often involves going through publicly available online information, as well as data from personal devices to put together the pieces and track someone down. It's a fugitive simulation. And then all of those bits of expertise combine to form my doctoral topic.
So Anjuli is an all-around badass when it comes to surveillance. Not her words, mine. And when you spend as much time in this world as she does, and then take a look at what's happening with protesters in the Black Lives Matter movement, well, it's worrying.
So it's tricky because my experience on Hunted is from the other side of things. It's very much, we're simulating a law enforcement or intelligence agency tracking down people who might be on the run. And so I've seen some of the capabilities that are available to people who are on that side of the equation. But as a brown woman in Britain, I'm very sympathetic and a strong supporter of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I was thinking more about how these protesters might not realise that they're being surveilled. So it's taking kind of a negative view of the technological capabilities.
There's the low-hanging fruit of surveillance that we're all familiar with. You know, you got your CCTV, that's a part of daily life, drones, helicopters following protesters around, and social media. You could see how police could use that to identify people at protests. But Anjuli says what we don't talk about is how much that technology has actually evolved.
The technological capabilities that the police have access to now have massive advantages over the kinds of things that they were able to do 10 years ago. Those are upgrades in terms of capability and quality and prevalence. And the example that I always think about is CCTV cameras. The rise of internet-connected consumer devices has facilitated the growth of an informal side of state surveillance infrastructure. And this is really well encapsulated by things like private camera-equipped doorbells that have an internet connection and allow police to access video footage. And those have become very popular. And technologies like facial recognition, artificial intelligence, biometrics, those are all emerging at the same time. So rather than being able to view CCTV cameras as a solid issue, as people might have been able to do in the 90s, you now have cameras that have multiple functionalities and are connected to the internet and are manufactured and sold cheaply and are not just sold to members of the public, but in fact, some police forces have given away Amazon Ring doorbells to communities for free to enable them to visually monitor the areas in front of people's houses. And that's fostered massive racial profiling of video subjects, which of course is particularly concerning considering police profiling of activists such as those who support Black Lives Matter, and potentially fatal when you consider the fact that there was that FBI report that showed that white supremacists had infiltrated American law enforcement to a very disconcerting level.
Back in May, protests in Portland, Oregon began over the police killing of George Floyd. They continued through the summer, and President Donald Trump sent in federal law enforcement to quash them.
In addition to normal policing efforts and then also very, very aggressive policing efforts, we also saw the deployment of these federal agents. There were reports of them not wearing badges, not wearing name tags, kidnapping people off the streets, bundling them into vans, and holding them in federal buildings. And ostensibly arresting Black Lives Matter protesters and surveilling them, profiling them, and intimidating them.
Quit policing people's protests! Quit policing people's protests!
And how exactly were they surveilling them? Well, Anjuli says they were using a piece of kit that is typically used by military surveillance teams.
So you have these different forms of technological surveillance that take in information on protesters en masse, and one of those forms is low-level voice intercept operations. And those involve using these military technologies, these very specialized technologies, to pick up on communications by scanning transmissions, scanning the airwaves, and then capturing these short bursts of conversation that could then be used against someone to incriminate or to prosecute someone, even if those bits of information, those short bursts of conversation are too brief to be grounded in enough context to tell you what someone was really saying. Imagine having a conversation, imagine having a breakup and then talking to your friend in person in a public park and saying, I just want to kill him, right? Obviously, you don't actually want to kill your ex, but that short burst of conversation could be picked up and then used afterwards to incriminate you.
And it's not just police surveillance that worries Anjuli. Technology has been moving so quickly. I mean, a few years ago, we didn't have doorbell cameras or Alexas or Fitbits watching and listening and tracking us. And these companies, they have piles and piles of data about you. And those laws that are out there to protect you, some are okay, some are out of date, and some are just bad.
In terms of policing, you no longer have, in my opinion, state-run law enforcement agencies that are completely siloed and isolated from any kind of corporate influence. And the example that I gave of Amazon Ring cameras is a really clear example of that. And then on top of that, it's a legal but ethically grey area where you've got law enforcement and intelligence agencies allying with these corporate hegemons to sort of create a state-industrial surveillance complex that definitely threatens certain civil liberties like the freedom to protest without having a dossier of your details compiled and kept on file as though you're a criminal, when actually protesting is very legal. And I think that this is particularly concerning when you realize that it's not just the technologies that are the problem, but also the law changing. So where the technologies can't be directly accessed by law enforcement, you would expect the need for warrants to be an important factor in protecting people's data. But there have been these very clear instances of states implementing legislation that forces metadata or data to be retained by the technology or communications companies that have created these devices that are gathering the data, right? So for example, in Australia, there's a mandatory retention of metadata for at least 2 years, with state agencies paying the companies that have to retain this data for access. Then on top of that, in America, you have examples of data being bought in bulk from, for example, social media companies, and then that's used for an agency's own purposes without necessarily needing to announce that there's journalistic data in there or there's protesters' data included in that bulk load. And that's particularly concerning for proponents of free speech because there's a clear erosion of the civil liberties that were previously, I would say, protected by established legal mechanisms like the need for a warrant from a judge if someone wants to look into a journalist or a protester. And this is where I sound kind of like a tinfoil hat wearing conspiracist, but it's my personal belief that you can't engage in normal human life and be a functional member of society at present in the UK or in the US in particular without also interacting with these massive technological structures and institutions that are springing up and that are very closely interlinked with the state. there's always going to be an asymmetry between where the technology is and where the law is, but we need to try and close that gap a little bit. And beyond that, we need to stop the law from what's actually happening at the moment, which is that it's increasingly being used to facilitate technology being used against civilians.
So what can you do? How do you stay safe and protest? Well, Anjuli says you gotta go basic.
I want to make it clear that it's close to impossible to entirely avoid these technological surveillance measures. The best someone can hope for might just be to make it so difficult or so expensive for someone tracking you to work out where you're going or who you are that they decide to focus their efforts elsewhere. But there are old school methods that still have utility today. So, for example, we've seen some of these crop up at recent protests in Hong Kong. Protesters might wear black or very dark clothing that isn't branded to protest, and then afterwards, to avoid the police identifying them as protesters based on the sort of uniform that they're wearing, they could slip out of these clothes into some other slightly more colourful clothing, so that the police near protests can't say with certainty that you're the same person who was just at that protest. That's a very simple one. It's also key, I would say, to try to keep up to date on any news articles that tell you what kind of surveillance tools have been used. And there are lots of articles out there that investigative reporters who are used to needing to know about this stuff have written to help protesters. And there are outlets like The Intercept that are really great at publishing these. And advices from these sources tend to include things like, I would say, using a burner phone that is on airplane mode, writing down the numbers of people that you would want to call in an emergency, not taking anything that could identify you or track you to a protest. And obviously it's very easy for me to say that in the abstract. In practice, that means, not wearing your smartwatch. It means not taking your normal mobile phone with you or your debit card. I think it's Mr. Weasley in Harry Potter. Don't trust anything that keeps its brain where you can't see it. Don't take technologies with you. It's the equivalent of taking someone along with you that has a clear allegiance to the forces that you're protesting against.
I mean, not gonna lie, after talking to you, I feel like I never want to leave my house again. Do you get that response from people often?
I try not to bring this up at dinner parties. No, I think there's a very fine line between wearing a tinfoil hat and also having a realistic understanding of what the dangers are. So honestly, I think that the default position that everyone should have regarding these new technologies is suspicion. I don't think that that's because I'm a conspiracist. I think it's because I'm actively researching these issues. And so I have a greater awareness of what the problems are than perhaps other people. But then I also rely on these technologies, right? I might not have any internet connected devices that would be considered novel or interesting, but I have a laptop. I still, use the internet. I still use social media, and it would be impossible to be a useful member of society if I didn't have those things. And especially during the pandemic, it would be impossible to stay connected to anyone. I would lose my mind.
And when it comes to technology, Anjuli says you can't just bury your head in the sand and hope it'll be okay. She's a firm believer that we need to act.
I would say, in addition to protesting for political changes and for changes in the structure of these institutions, it's also really important to push for legal changes and increased regulations of these technologies, because that could have a massive positive effect.
This podcast was brought to you by Oxford Sparks from the University of Oxford, with music by John Lyons and a special thanks to Anjuli Shere. And there are a lot of other smart people out there who are thinking about these issues. So if you are looking for more information, we highly recommend that you check out writing by Simone Browne, Shoshana Zuboff, and Ken Klippenstein. Links to their work are going to be in the show notes of this episode, so you don't have to go too far to find them. And tell us what you think about this podcast. We are on the internet at Oxford Sparks and got a website, oxfordsparks.ox.ac.uk. I'm Emily Elias. Bye for now.